All right, everybody. Welcome to the first Captive Thought podcast. I'll be your host, Aaron. We're on right now. We're on YouTube and YouTube and TikTok. It was going to go to Instagram, but there was something went afoul right as I hit start stream. So we'll have to figure that out later. But this is the Captive Thought podcast. We're going to try to make this weekly. And the idea is we're going to get on here and we want to engage atheists. Not gonna lie, the goal is to put atheism on trial. The goal is to show people that they've been duped by atheism, that it's a worldview that is empty, can't provide them with what they want, which really is peace with God, and that Christianity is the only worldview that can actually make sense of the human experience. So we're going to do that through topics. It's not just going to be call in and say whatever you want, and I'll answer all your questions like I'm Frank Turek. That's not the plan. The plan is to have topics and then to get on here and engage these topics and really see the difference between the Christian and the non-Christian worldview. We can start there with atheists. They think of the world in terms of atheism and theism. We're going to reject those categories from the start. We see the world as Christian and non-Christian, right? And we're going to show how the Christian worldview is the only worldview that actually holds up to scrutiny. So the name of the podcast is Captive Thought. This 10:5 logo that I have, that is the verse that the name of the podcast is based off of, and I'm going to pull it up here. 2 Corinthians 10:5. Try that again. I don't want to misquote it. So 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, crushing it here to start. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. And that is what we're going to do here. So we want to engage atheist arguments. This is not going to be the Christianity on Trial podcast where you come up here and you say, give me your best evidence for God, and then that's kind of the end of it. You know what? I forgot to do. I need to put the StreamYard link in. Wait, maybe I did. Nope, I need to put the StreamYard link up. How am I going to do that here on the fly? Let's see if I can do that in YouTube. All right, here we go. Maybe you can use this there, TikTokers. If you're on TikTok, there's a StreamYard link if you want to use that, but you can also come in here live and talk to me if you want to be a guest. That's fine. We're taking live guests. I got someone. Oh, I will accept. What does that say? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Let me see here.
It's a bit of feedback so I can hear my own voice.
Okay, that's not good. Is it a lot of feedback?
Yeah, it's like perfectly clear. I can always be here for technical assistance for the time being. Just use me as like a dummy to see if it's working.
We went through this yesterday, and I'm going to check something real quick. We went through this yesterday. Me and my friend had this working. This feedback was the number one thing we were struggling with.
Yeah.
Well, the bad part is I didn't change anything. So we'll start at the top. How about that? Oh, you know what, I think I did change one thing. Let me see. Does that help at all?
All right, testing.
Yeah. Do you still hear an echo?
Okay, the feedback should be solved. Yeah, the feedback should be solved.
Can you say that one more time? What do you say in the feedback? What?
The feedback's gone, so
Oh, it's gone.
the problem is solved.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was reading.
Whatever you did has worked.
That's perfect. I was reading online, like, what's the best way to, settings, and they said turn off the echo cancellation if you're using this Rodecaster Pro, Rodecaster Pro 2 that I got. So hey, how you doing? How do I pronounce your screen name there?
Just penguin is fine for the sake of
that'll work.
pronunciation.
All right, Penguin.
Yeah.
We'll start at the top. Are you an atheist?
Well, I assume you guys are Christians, so seeing as atheist rejection of God or gods, and God is presumably defined as some like agent creator of the universe, then yeah, I'd probably be an atheist.
Okay. What was the first thing you said about Christian?
Well, because seeing as atheism is rejection of God or gods, and the definition of God can vary, meaning whether or not I'd reject it would vary. I'm just going to assume or presume, because it's justified, that you guys are Christians. So then I'll be an atheist towards the Christian God, effectively.
Okay, that's fine. But you're an atheist towards any God. Do you really care?
Any God that's like an agent creator of the universe, yeah.
Okay. Are there gods that you're not atheistic towards?
Not
like,
under any normal definition of God.
Okay. So are you just trying to expand the concept a little bit so that you're not so rigid? Is that the goal?
I'm not trying to expand it. I think it's just because a lot of people use it in a really like esoteric way. Like some people will say, "Oh, God is actually just what's like what's necessary," right? And it's like, okay, that's not very like elaborative. Or God is just it's just energy. Like there's so many esoteric ways people define God. So I'm just clarifying like the one that I'm specifically negating.
It sounds like you care less about some person who gives you like sort of this vague notion of God that you can't even really respond to.
Yeah, especially when it's like completely incoherent.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, we're talking about the Christian God, and you're watching this on TikTok, so the topic is faith is greater than science. And this is something very specific. Well, let me get your initial reaction to the idea that faith is greater than science, or do you need more information from me?
I do. I'm curious as to how faith is being defined first.
Okay. Well, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to use the Bible. So I'm using Hebrews 11:1. Okay. I'm going to read things so I don't say them wrong. All right. So Hebrews 11:1 actually gives us a really good definition of faith. So it's not blind faith. It's not believing something without evidence. All right. So Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." So I'm not going to get into a huge Bible study here, but I want to just point out a couple of things. That word assurance there means foundation. And when it says things hoped for, that's not like, ooh, I hope I get a bike for Christmas. Really what it means expected. So faith is the foundation of the things you expect, right? And the conviction of things not seen. And that word conviction is actually legal language in the ancient Greek, but it's this idea of persuasive evidence. Okay, so faith is the assurance of, or the foundation of what you expect, and the persuasive evidence of things you haven't seen yet. Okay, so that's the definition I'm using.
Okay, and is by science, is this the scientific method, or is this like scientism as like an ideology? Like how is science being fleshed out?
Yeah, the scientific method, that's actually an interesting point. I wrestled with how to say it, but I just went with like popular lingo as science. But I mean the scientific method, I mean general scientific inquiry of any type. I mean, me personally, I think scientism is foolishness, but if someone wanted to take that point, but no, it doesn't have to necessarily be scientism. And what I'm getting at is that faith is actually the foundation of science. That's how I would put it. Because
right, well, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll listen.
Well, I was just going to determine whether or not faith in this definition is also assuming some sort of theological implications. Because if not, then I could just potentially draw a symmetry between the two words and say they're not different.
Draw a symmetry between what two words?
Faith and science.
Oh, yeah. I might not even be that far against that. I guess what I would want to demonstrate is that everybody lives by faith. So in the world we live in, there's this false battle between faith and science, right? Not even faith and science. I'll put it another way on YouTube. This is how I put it, that faith is, I'm sorry, that the world says seeing is believing, but really believing is seeing, that you got to believe first before you see. And so I would say faith is the foundation of science, in that you have your foundations, right, in science, things that you expect, the laws of logic, induction. There's actually a bunch of them, right? But we don't need to talk about all of them. We just pick a couple. That's your foundation for what you expect. You expect the world to be logical. You expect tomorrow to be like today. But like David Hume pointed out, tomorrow's unseen. And we really don't know what tomorrow will be like, right? And we have the conviction of evidence, the persuasive evidence of, the past has been like the future. But it's still unseen, right? It's still, or would you say it's certain? Would you say 100% certain the future is going to be like the past? And I don't mean like in every event. I don't mean in every event, but I mean like, in the general normativity of nature.
What? Or can you better rephrase the question? Are you asking if we can like non-circularly demonstrate the uniformity of nature?
Yeah, or laws of logic, or.
Well, yeah, I don't think you can like non-circularly like demonstrate or justify something that undercuts justification, right? It's like Munchausen's trilemma, right? So no, so I'd agree with you, right? Continue.
Okay. So then if we both agree that, the evidence that the future will be like the past is that the future has been like the past, and we agree that that's circular, the next thing we got to look at is what our foundation is, right? What's that assurance? And
okay, I think. Oh my God, sorry, you took a pause. I wasn't sure if you were gonna like if that was you stopping. No. I'll need to continue. Then I'll respond like when you're given the full.
Well, I would say that's the end. Then the next thing we would look at is that assurance. So what do you think about faith in science? When I say faith is greater than science, I say you can't do science unless you have faith first.
Well, I think obviously it's supposed to be like a provocative title, right? And if anything, I can appreciate this, right? It kind of draws from like transcendental arguments in a nice conversational manner rather than like a question begging kind of thing. So to me, it basically just seems that you're not defining it in like an arbitrary manner, right? You've drawn from the Bible, whether or not the definitions of the word you're using are true. I'll just trust your judgment about the etymology of the words.
Yeah.
In saying the foundation of things expected and the persuasiveness of evidence of things not seen. If that is how it's being fleshed out, then yeah, you could just say that's kind of like a way to summarize like the basis of epistemology, for example. And if you're just defining faith as the basis of epistemology is greater than the scientific method, which is after the basis of epistemology, then yeah, I'd probably just grant that. Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. I was actually expecting more pushback, but you're following along. This would be the first time I've actually explained it to someone, besides just developing this in my head. So I'm glad that you followed along. It makes me feel like it's actually coherent. Okay.
If your TikTok stream cut out, like 15 seconds you cut out after saying that you expected more pushback. So you're gonna have to recapitulate what you said after saying you expected more pushback.
I said I had not said this to anybody until right there. And so it's nice to know that, once I brought it out of my head to you, you understood and you're like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I know what you're getting at. Yeah. I'm happy to also go on to the foundation if you want.
Yeah, and then I'm gonna just pull it out a little bit further, is that everybody lives by faith all the time, really. I mean, right? If you didn't already have a foundation of something you expect, if you didn't know when you opened your door to your bedroom what the world was going to be like, you wouldn't do it, right? So before you even start your day, before you do anything, you have faith, because the future is always unseen. So we're always forever stepping into the unseen.
I think that's only obviously in virtue of the epistemology, right? So like a way I'd kind of outline it is for any epistemology you have you either have like infinitism, axioms, or circularity. You have some sort of like baseline upon which you're kind of doing your reasoning. You
Mm-hmm.
can't like non-inferentially you can't inferentially justify, right? It's what is kind of undercutting inference and justification and logic and stuff. And then once you assume those on a non-evidential, or like logical basis, then you can infer things. I'd say that once I've already established my epistemological kind of axioms, then no, it wouldn't be faith upon which I'm, deliberating about life. But you could say that, in the way you're using faith, I'm faithful that there will be a uniformity of nature, right? So that's the part that I'm agreeing with, which is presumably what you're saying.
So once you establish axioms, though, do axioms actually move you closer to knowing? I mean,
Well, for the sake of,
go ahead.
I was going to say, well, if knowledge is defined as something like, JTB with like no false lemmas and whatever other like additional stuff you want to have, then justification is going to be some sort of inference, right? Where inference is based on some epistemological axioms. So it's something like once you have these axioms that kind of establish how inference works, then you have a justification once you're using them, but you're following, whatever axioms are being used. So yes, you can have knowledge, but it's not in kind of like an infallible or like a non-circular way.
Which I think is the problem with atheism, right? Because
I think it's unavoidable.
with atheism, I think you are forced to stop
No,
there.
I think it's unavoidable. I think it's unavoidable universally across any worldview.
Well, just in saying that, I mean, you're kind of begging the question, because I would say that in the Christian worldview, it's not unavoidable. In fact, it is very much avoided.
Well, but via what is it being avoided? Because if any basis on which you're inferring something is knowledge, you're going to have some sort of inferential framework. But in order to justify that framework, you need further inferences. You just get like an infinite chain of justifying inferences with an inferential framework, and inferring that framework, which is already to presuppose another inferential framework.
Well, unless you can find a legitimate backstop, right?
That would just be like an axiom, because you'd be like you basically like you're either doing one of two things. You're either having some kind of meta explanation, which isn't like that's not like solving the problem. It's just like explaining the ontology behind it, right? It's like if you're doing like a worldview comparison. It's like saying, oh, but what is it that exists out there that explains the epistemology? Or you're doing something like, okay, how do I kind of derive this framework? Obviously, that would be the one that you can't non-circularly do. But if you're asking about the meta justification, and that's not escaping the problem, that's just comparing worldviews.
So real quick, an axiom only really has meaning within a framework, right? So we're not really comparing axioms, we're comparing the framework within which you might choose your axioms, right?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah. And what we don't want to do is you have your framework with your axioms and I have my framework with my axioms, right? And then we just stand inside our frameworks and critique each other's axioms. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because I'm immediately from the start, I'm rejecting your framework, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I'm looking for the foundation of my framework. That's how I think about it, like a foundation. And then I have this network of presuppositions, right? That's built on this foundation.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by a worldview. Within that, you can have axioms, but let me ask you this. Why do you say that Christianity can't escape the epistemological quagmire that you're in? That atheism is in.
Because the framework we're discussing is epistemology, right? It's how you have knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
where there's presumably some sort of like justification, unless you're like gonna say that any immediate belief you have or any immediate seeming you have is a 100% certain truth about some external reality, assuming you commit to an external reality.
Yeah.
So the kind of dilemma we have, well, the dilemma we have is we both want to try and say we can have knowledge, and we say, but how do we know we have knowledge? And there's going to be some kind of like reasoning behind that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Descartes famously, he has basic beliefs under foundationalism, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
basically and self-evidently the case that we can experience things, for example, that would be like, or like I see this apple to be a basic belief, but maybe the reason why it's there isn't a basic belief. You have maybe like coherentist framework, so there's like a bit of circularity, but it's like as long as they work together with one another. You have like infinitism, which is what I was mentioning before, where you just go, oh, but how do you establish this framework? Oh, what is inferred from this framework, and how is it inferred? And how is that framework? How is that framework justified or whatever? Oh, it's justified because of this framework, and you go
Mm-hmm.
kind of ad infinitum. Maybe you could say this is just me kind of doing like argument from silence, but I've never once seen, nor can I reasonably imagine how someone could derive a justification for a framework of inference or knowledge, whatever word you want to use, without already presupposing some inferential, or reasoning framework.
Right. And I'm not against presuppositions. In fact, I agree with you. Like level, at some level, you have to argue circularly when you're talking about ultimate truths, right? If you appeal to something to prove your ultimate truth, well, that thing you appealed to would be your ultimate truth. So at
Yes,
some
yeah,
at some
exactly.
point you have to step into circularity, but it's not necessarily fallacious. It can be,
No,
yeah, right. It can be reasonable. Like I think the easiest one, for anyone's listening, you might already know this, but I think a really easy example is the laws of logic. Right? You can't even argue against them without using them. So that's a good example of where circularity is completely justified and not fallacious.
yeah, sure, I could pretty commit to
Right?
that, yeah.
Yeah. So then what would you need to get that foundation, that assurance, right? So that you can know the universe will be logical and that tomorrow will be like today and whatever other things you want to add to it. I don't want to make it too complicated, but um, for some people listening, we don't have to get into this, but for the reliability of your senses, um, there's a million other things you could put in there. Objective morality, I think, is necessary for science. So there's other things, but we could talk about, I think logic and induction is kind of easy. Um, so what would you need? That's the question. What must be true first before we can actually know anything to escape this epistemological quagmire? But that I'm not saying we're in, by the way. I'm saying there isn't a problem with epistemology precisely because atheism is not true and Christianity is true. So I'm not saying that there's a problem. But if we're, sort of granting your worldview, what would need to be true in order to escape that?
Well, I'm not sure that it's kind of like coherently able to be solved, right? This is all kind of like trying to solve it within human reasoning. And obviously, as I was saying, the dilemma is how do you justify that you have knowledge where any justification would itself need justification, right? That's the problem. So then the question is, I feel like if you were to say, oh, yeah, but what is the justification, which seems to be kind of like summatively what you were guessing at, then it's like, well, I'm not sure what you're kind of asking here, right? I don't
Yeah.
think like an atheist can give you a way to kind of undercut and explain a framework without invoking another framework. And I
Right.
don't think a theist could either. But
Okay.
unless if you're asking something like, oh, well, what is it that like could be true about nature that you could use as kind of like a paradigmatic like explanation for the epistemology? I could do that, but that wouldn't be escaping the circularity. It would just be us comparing worldviews, as I said earlier.
Okay. Well, I'm asking you to not be stuck in atheism as well, right? I'm not saying you have to stay in an atheist framework. Don't necessarily throw away the question because it doesn't fit in the framework. Let's maybe the problem's the framework, not the question, right?
It's not to atheism. I'm not answering on the basis of atheism. I'm just saying when it comes to reasoning,
Mm-hmm.
in order to justify knowledge, right? There's some justification that's framework that determines how you obtain knowledge, or what statements like are true of the world and which ones aren't.
Mm-hmm.
But then you'd say, okay, but what justifies this framework? How do you know that framework is true? Or what's the basis on which you assume these axioms? Or what causes this? Or isn't that vicious circularity? Right? You end up with these problems, and it just goes to a regress, or you have to just have some unjustified claim upon which you begin doing justifications. And I'm not. I haven't seen a posit from a theist side as to the explanation for that. I don't think it's intrinsic to atheism, right? Because that problem doesn't involve any God or the lack thereof in me outlining that regression or circularity or,
Yeah.
or axioms or whatever.
Okay. So I get what you're saying, but I'm asking you, I'm trying to get you to think like what would you need? Like it can't be that there's no parameters under which we could like for sure know that what we're, that our human experience is real. It can't be that there's zero parameters, that we're all just stuck. Right?
Well, I don't think it's even coherent. Like go on, Karen.
Well, I was going to just cheat and say, obviously you know what I'm thinking, right?
Yeah, but for you to say God, to me, that's functionally just the same as an axiom, right? It's like saying, okay, well, these are all grounded in the fact that a God exists. Or, like an atheist, maybe some sort of naturalist could say something like, oh, well, the reason uniformity of nature exists is because there exists some quantum field Q that necessarily grounds counterfactuals and particulars, for example, right? Someone could just stipulate that, and then you could either go, oh, okay, that's fair enough, or you go, oh, but how do you know that? And then you're just back to the problem again. Same with God.
So you're actually not back to the problem again. And that's one thing that I would press, is that you're actually not back to the problem. Now, you're back to the problem if all you're talking about is how can you know, right? From your perspective, how can you know? But let's go from epistemology to ontology. What if the God of the Bible actually exists? Like in the way that he's described in the Bible, and he is the creator, and he created you to know him, and he gave you your mind so that you could know him, and he gave you your senses, and the laws of logic reflect who he is, and he upholds the universe with the word of his power, so we can expect it to be uniform, and he promised the seasons and cycles will continue, and he's faithful, so they will. Would you say that foundation allows you to say with certainty that tomorrow will be like today?
I'm not sure about certainty, right? Because obviously, if it's logically possible that supposed fact about that proposal about the world is wrong, then it's logically possible that there's no.
But that was my question. That was my question. My question was, I want you to just hypothetically grant that that's true and that God exists. Can we then say we know?
I guess you could argue that if it's like stipulated that like it's some certainty about the world that we now have like reliable I don't know, cognitive faculties or whatever, and that logic holds because God is just like he's perpetual in his nature doesn't change and he's like always there.
Mm-hmm.
Then you could probably have a reasonable framework on which to say that my cognitive faculties are functioning, and maybe something like uniformity of nature. I'm not sure about anything to do with like infallibilism, or I'm not even sure what it would mean to like know for certain that you can know things.
I'm not saying that people.
If
I'm not saying our knowledge would be perfect, and I'm not saying people would automatically know everything perfectly and be sure of everything. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if the God of the Bible exists in the way he's described, good, loving, faithful, right? All of those things, just, wrathful, it doesn't matter, all of his qualities. And he created us to know him, to have relationship with him. If he exists, does that not solve the problem? Whether we know it or not is irrelevant. If he exists, that solves the problem.
If he exists, and well, I guess if we don't need to know that he exists, it's just the case that he is in the universe, then yeah, sure, we'd know things.
Okay, and then so given that, well, and I would okay. So we've established that the God of the Bible gives us the foundation that we need, the epistemological foundation that we need, right? And it's because of his character, because of who he is. And we know it's not atheism. We agreed to that in the beginning. And we know we can analyze other worldviews. We can look at other frameworks. And we can look at, because we've agreed, I say God of the Bible, but I would think that the next logical step would be like, oh, what about another God? But we can look at other frameworks and we can see where they lack the triune God of the Bible. And so they lack that foundation for us to know. Would you agree with that? They keep telling me to turn this mic up, so I'm listening, but
Whereas you're asking me if I have any like competing hypotheses, is that what you're saying? Well, competing models, is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, and I don't want to force something. I probably shouldn't have said that. I don't want to force you to like say something, but I would say we can compare worldviews and see. We've established there's one worldview that bridges the gap, right? The gap that Descartes couldn't bridge, the gap that Kant couldn't bridge, the gap that Hume didn't try to bridge, right? There is an answer that bridges the gap between my mind and the external world, but only if he actually exists, really exists.
Wait, to clarify, just to make sure I'm understanding, when you say that Descartes couldn't bridge it, if he had bridged it, would it have been something like if he just proposed that? Okay, this is like I'm going to be like speaking really abstractly and vaguely. If he just proposed some model of thing that exists in which he'd have like the faculties of knowing things, is that basically what he needed to have done? But he didn't. He just said that I think, therefore I am.
Yeah. So the problem with I think, therefore I am, and so I don't know how familiar with you are, but I'm going to just say this for people listening. Descartes was a mathematician. He was actually trying to bridge the gap between his mind and science and mathematics, right? That's what was important to him. Does my microphone sound terrible? It sounds really loud.
No, it's been perfectly fine the whole time.
Okay, cool. So Descartes tried to bridge that gap, and he was doubting, and then he got to the bottom of doubt, which is just, if I doubt my own existence, I at least know that something is doubting, right? And then he tried to build from there. And he tried to build by proving God exists. Now, he knew he couldn't bridge the gap from his mind to the real world without God. The problem where Descartes messed up is he tried to do it by starting with himself, with his mind, and arguing to God. And that's actually what I'm doing here is the opposite. And I didn't think of this, Cornelius Van Til did. But it only works. It only works if we start at God and work your way down. Well, I guess I should say, you don't start with yourself and work to God. You start with God and work to yourself. God has to be the foundation, or else you're stuck.
Okay, so it's just metaphysics that make the epistemological commitments coherent, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, then that's fine. Yeah, I can probably give a competing worldview then.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
I can probably do a worldview analysis then, like a comparison.
Yeah, you're saying you could take the Christian worldview and compare it to other worldviews and see if anything else.
I can compare it to a worldview, yeah.
Yeah, and see if any other worldview can. Right.
Yep.
And what we would find out is that no other worldview can.
Well, we should do it now.
Okay, which one do you want to use? Which one do you want to pick?
Okay, so I'm thinking of effectively what as like a general pipeline of things we need to do objective wise is we need to have some method by which we can ensure like reliable processes, right? Obviously on like a parsimonious ground we could just stipulate things, but obviously it needs to be like a coherent kind of lineage of events where it's like you have something and down the chain it leads to you having reliable cognitive faculties or whatever. We want to have uniformity of nature. I mean, morality isn't really that important. It's like a higher order thing. So we're going to focus on things like uniformity of nature primarily, right?
Yeah, because, stuff like that. Ultimate
as long as we know,
I shouldn't say ultimate.
Yeah, because obviously if we know we can like observe things, right? At least seemingly it's like a basic belief we can observe things.
Right.
It's more about how do you know the observations are going to track anything, right? How do you know there's external reality? And how do you know there's a uniformity of nature? So for me, I'd probably say something. This is what I mentioned earlier, right? This wasn't like me just pulling up on the spot. I've had a conversation like these before. This has been one of the better ones, let's say, because actually fleshed it out, right? There's it's although it's not like an argument I'm particularly massively fond of. It gets a lot more hate than it should because if people run it properly, it's quite an interesting discussion where it's just how comprehensive is your metaphysics, which I quite enjoy. So yeah, I'll put it to something like, I admit the idea of this is a stalking horse, right? So I'm going to try and have any commitments be ones that mirror God where absolutely necessary, and then in any other case, it's just mitigating the assumptions in terms of like ontological commitments and the amount of features involved. So I think starting off, we're going to want to have something that's necessary as well.
Mm-hmm.
So typically for kind of theistic models of necessity, you're going to have some agent, and the necessity is just in virtue of its nature, which you can like heuristically categorize as stuff like aseity,
Mm-hmm.
omnipotence,
Mm-hmm.
omniscience, stuff like that. Obviously, those are going to be just stipulations in virtue of the theory. You can't like derive aseity without assuming necessity or vice versa. So that's like it's kind of within the model, like within the metaphysical thesis, is you have things like aseity and whatnot. I'd mirror that. I'd have some sort of like, for the sake of scientific, honesty and having one less assumption, I'd probably have some sort of quantum field placeholder, whether committing to like a pluralism of all the quantum fields or kind of like one unifying like quantum vacuum kind of thing. I'm not a physicist, so it's got a lot that's going to be like kind of like placeholder abstractions, which I think is fine because it's not like the God hypothesis is going into like deep scientific analysis of the features. It's kind of like broad metaphysics. So I'd say you have some sort of quantum field,
But why do
whether
you
it be
think
like a pluralism.
why do you think a
Say
quantum
again.
field? Why do you think a quantum field? Do you think
Well,
of
I
a quantum
think
field as something
I'm
that's like eternal?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I can put even basically right. The kind of line of reasoning I have is under theism, typically, unless you're like an idealist or you deny, what's in science, which would be like a different discussion. But seemingly, you don't deny science; you just say the faith undercuts it, right? Is you'd be committing to what's understood under science, and then say God is the explanation for it, right?
Yeah.
I'm presuming. Then what I'd say is, if possible, I would just take whatever the most fundamental thing is in science that theists would be committed to, and then just avoid adding God to that. So for me, I'd say something like, if the most fundamental thing in physics understood currently is quantum fields, then what we could do is just attribute any properties we would to God to the quantum field where reasonable, right? Not just like complete bare stipulation, although they wouldn't be like that unreasonable. And then say, okay, we're already kind of like up a step, because rather than going one step on the ladder and saying God, we're going to just kind of attribute whatever explanatory role he has to what's most fundamental under physics. That's the motivation for why it's quantum fields, in terms of like why I selected those. And if you mean, why is it that quantum fields are necessary, then as I said a minute ago, it'd just be on the same kind of basis as you would for God, right? It's you just produce it as a placeholder that grounds contingency.
Yeah, not as a placeholder for contingency. As a placeholder for intelligibility, as a placeholder for explain. I don't think of God as a placeholder. I don't think I like that. Is that what you're? I guess maybe I
Well, no,
mislooking.
but I mean, for the sake of like explanations, right? You're using it to account for all this data, and you just construct a model for it, right? It's not like we look like, okay, you could argue that you got there for observation, but let's say someone runs a contingency argument, for example, right? You would say, okay, you start off and say, okay, we've got the contingent things. What's an explanation for them, and then construct a model for like this placeholder of necessary beings. So when I'm saying placeholder, I'm referring to like whatever we're just committing to being fundamental, and then just whatever additional features you kind of put on top of that. Because I am personally convinced by the Leibnizian contingency argument, right? I do agree to the PSR. I
Yeah.
do commit to a necessary grounding. I just don't think it needs to be agential to derive things like uniformity of nature.
But aren't quantum fields like mathematical structures? Or I shouldn't say they are. Don't they depend on like mathematical things and physical constants? Like, don't you already have to have a coherent universe first? Or even if it's not a universe, a
No,
coherent, you can take a step. I mean, you can take a step outside that if you want, but don't you have to have that coherent first? Like they're
no, and
contingent, right?
the kind of line of the kind of line of no, because the line of reasoning I can follow, right, is that okay? Well, I think there's a couple kind of things to note, right? The first thing is that obviously when it comes to someone like God, you're going to say you're going to, where possible, you're going to want to try and reduce things to his nature. You don't want to say, oh, God is constrained by, or God is in addition to anything. You want to say, X, Y, and Z is as a result of his nature, right? Like, when I say things like laws of logic aren't they don't constrain God, right? That would be like adding some dependencies there. You want to say the laws of logic are constitutive or kind of reflections of God's nature, right? So when it comes to anything that would be adjacent to that, you'd make a similar move with the quantum fields. When it comes to things like uh, well, people call them nomological laws, right, which is basically laws of physics, but under like a reductive physicalism model, you could just reduce these to the quantum fields and say that similar to how God has certain desires, this kind of like quantum field placeholder or quantum fields, if it's I'm not having some unifying one, they, in virtue of their nature, they're disposed to produce certain things, which is kind of like a non-agential desire, where laws of nature are actually just like strict regularities in their behavior in virtue of how they are, containing these certain dispositions.
Yeah, and I'm listening to you, and what's going through my mind is why doesn't this just push the problem back one step? That's the thought I'm having. I'm going, all right, how is this not just pushing the problem back one step? Because we still got to have like a logical, orderly, rational world for before we can even think about quantum. And I don't mean us think about it, but I mean before quantum fields even have any meaning. And we already have to have those things. Like I'm trying to stay.
Yes, meta, right? But I think
Yeah.
the surely you'd have a similar issue with God, right? If you're going to talk about God's features, you're going to say, well, surely discussing God's features and attributing these as an explanatory model, you'd already need a coherent reality under which to use these terms. Well, yes, right. But
Yeah.
we're just taking that. We're taking the fact that we do have this experience, we do have these terms, and we're going to go, okay, well, what is the best account for them? So presumably that's kind of like a symmetrical problem.
But where God actually is a good account for these terms is that he's a rational, personal being, right? Where these things are a reflection of him. And so, where do things like these terms come from? Something like a quantum field, something physical or something natural. Am I
Well,
thinking
I
right?
would be getting
Am
to
I
that,
on the
right?
right? Am I following you?
Yes, yeah. Okay. Well, arguably, physical and natural kind of like ill-defined. So I'm just going to define physical as what's understood under physics, basically.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah. I don't want to say spatially located because it's not the quantum field is spatially located. So they define how temporality and spatiality work. But yeah, the idea is everything's just reducible to them, right? It's like I think honestly the two main symmetries, or okay, two main symmetries between the God model and the, let's just call it Q, right? Is one, Q is not agential, it has no willpower or consciousness or desires, although I don't really find any of those to really make that much sense around a physicalist model anyway. And the other thing would be oh shit, I forgot what I was even gonna say.
That's all
Like
right.
the general line of reasoning, right, is that you would take the other part was that anything that the quantum fields produce aren't like ontologically independent, right? I'm not sure what your view is on God's creation, but for the sake of the discussion, many Christians will say something like when God like eternally sustains the universe, right? Some people might say that, but they'll still say the universe is like different from God. It's like emergence. It like depends on him to exist, and any changes in God can change the universe. But like the universe is something distinct. Whereas under our reductive physicalism, something like an electron, it's not like the quantum field produces this like billiard ball and it just goes off and does its own thing. No, it's like that is just it's just representative of activity in the quantum field. Any
Right.
you know electrons, quarks, photons, whatever, you know, whether it's quantum fields or a unifying one, they're all products of the respective field rather than being in addition to it. So that's the other difference, right? They're not on top. They're distinct in terms of a quantum field is just some like overarching like totality or like kind of entity, and then the excitations like individual activities in that quantum field, but they're
Yeah.
not independent from it, right? These are all just reducible to it. Those are the two distinctions, right? That and it's not agential. So when it comes to things like how are you deriving rationality, yes, it might seem that God is immediately exempt from the kind of warrior eye rose. That's only because it's more simplistic to get rationality from God because you can just stipulate that okay, rationality is a mental thing, or like whatever you'd call it, like a mind thing. God
Yeah.
is a mind, so you can get it directly from him. But I don't think that's an issue. All I have to do is just say that rationality just arises in some higher order sense. So I can say that uniformity of nature is just from the dispositions of the quantum fields, right? Similar to God, right? So laws of logic, for example. Okay, let me know if I'm yapping too much. Like just
No.
say stop if I
Okay.
go
Well,
on too
I
much.
just, yeah. Okay. So I guess what I was thinking is, how does this move us to assurance, right? Because we said the assurance of things hoped for and the convictions of things not seen. So how does this move us towards that foundation?
Well, my line of reasoning is kind of comparing it to the God, because always it's a paradigmatic comparison, and most of this is something that I commit to it on like a philosophical basis, but a lot of it's engineered towards a problem like this. So when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to about how is it kind of assuring in the metaphysical thesis sense, like how what's like the grounding or context, as another precept calls it for the epistemology.
Yeah. Because I felt
I
like
think that
you kind of appealed to brute fact there for a second.
I don't think I did in any sense that's not symmetrical to theism effectively, right? Because you could say that there's kind of like there's no explanation for why God has these features. They're just in virtue of his nature, or because it's just logically necessary, where logic is still just God's nature, right? You could derive a similar problem there, which is again what the mirroring's for. So when it comes to how are you producing certainty, well, if God's production of certainty is you're producing some placeholder or kind of metaphysical thesis, entity, right? Some entity that's the core of the metaphysical thesis, and it's kind of stipulated that he has this nature that's logical, because obviously rational is something like following laws of logic and being coherent. So basically what it's saying is God is coherent and logical, and these are understood in a sense where we know what logic is. We have a kind of basic understanding of what it means for something to be coherent, right? Makes sense. We can understand it. So we're saying, okay, God embodies those. He embodies the kind of epistemological um, principles that we know, kind of like a baseline. So I'd say the same thing with the quantum field, right? If it's the case that God, um, in virtue of his nature, is logical, right? So he doesn't like contradicts himself, or however you flesh it out and make sense of that. And he has a desire such that um, the nature is intelligible or whatever, because he's intelligible, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because those are just stipulations as part of the theory, just on top of the kind of the core, most important part, right, that makes God God, right, at least in my opinion, being the agency, right, the willpower, the fact he's some mind,
But brute fact is
because these are all stipulated,
when you step into
including mine, because I don't think that's actually necessary to achieve it.
when you step into brute fact, you're just stepping into arbitrariness, right? You're just, and I don't mean this as an insult, but it's kind of the end of reasoning. I'm like, I'm not thinking about this anymore. I'm not justifying it anymore. I'm just stepping into brute fact, and I'm saying it is what it is. But I don't think that's God. I don't, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, um, I'm making an argument towards necessity, right? That everything else is only possible because this necessarily exists. Well, you might have heard it then, the impossibility of the contrary, right? You probably heard that keyword. Like if it
Yeah.
has to exist, because if it doesn't, and if it doesn't exist exactly as God has revealed himself in Christianity, another reason it's not arbitrary, exactly as he's revealed himself in Christianity, then you are necessarily left with a problem. And that's why, I say faith. Well, we're kind of actually off the topic of faith is greater than science a little bit, but that's why faith is greater than science. Christian faith, not just any faith, Christian faith, because you have to have that foundation. Without that foundation, you're really, um, you're really hoping, right? I mean, when I say hoping in terms of science from an atheist worldview, it really is, ooh, I hope I get a bike for Christmas. It really is, I hope that tomorrow is like today, because I really don't have a foundation for it. So we live like we have the foundation, right? We don't go into the world like we can't know anything. So we've already admitted that we live by faith. We admit that faith is the foundation of science, is the foundation for everything we do. We go into the world and we live according to this faith, and we expect the world to be a certain way. So we're already living, you're already living the Christian life, right? Because you're living with the certainty that God gives. You're just not giving God the glory for the certainty. So my question would be, why are we stopping where we're stopping?
Well, I think an important kind of springboard, right? As you mentioned, possibility of the contrary. Typically, the motivation of that isn't through like deduct like a syllogism off the bat. Is typically something like it's a claim they make, and then they warrant it by saying, all the worldviews we're going to analyze and have ever been analyzed, on the public stage, or from my experience, fail to account for these things in a coherent or parsimonious way. Because for me, it's the kind of the tag thing is it's aiming for contradictions. If there aren't contradictions, then it's which one is most abductively warranted. So in this case, we are doing that analysis, and then once we get to the contention between, okay, we have this set of, it's to me, right, brute facts versus brute facts, that being the features of the necessary entity. You can't then return back and say, oh, but it's because it's a contradiction to have it otherwise, because that's what we're trying to motivate, right? I'm saying that if we're trying to provide a metaphysical thesis for the foundation, epistemological axioms or whatever, then we're going to be comparing. And for me, it's, this Q, for example, which has, such properties that effectively mirror theism minus being a mind. Then for you to go, oh no, but it needs to have a mind because it's a contradiction otherwise. Well, impossible otherwise. Basically, just saying it's a contradiction. You need to derive a contradiction, right? What about the lack of a mind prevents it from being able to, provide a foundation of these epistemological axioms? Because either you have one to mind already, or it's an assumption as to how well it explains the data, in which case it's abductive.
Will you just say that last sentence again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so okay, I'm going to have to like recapitulate.
I know you're like, I was cooking there, and now you want me to do it again?
When it comes to determining which of them can account for the epistemological axioms, right, it's going to be which of them is most abductively warranted. Because unless you can find some actual when you say impossible of the contrary, right, you're trying to find an actual contradiction in the rejection of God as a necessary foundation. But unlike in many cases where an atheist will have this, well, in this case, naturalist has this discussion, they'll just deny a background entirely, and then maybe you can provide a contradiction from that. But I'm not denying a foundation or an ultimate context or a grounding for epistemological axioms. I'm just contending with your framework and saying, look, I don't need to commit to all the things you commit to. I just need to commit to X, Y, and Z because they sufficiently explain the data. So then, if there's no contradiction, then it's abductive.
So do you think it's important that we're able to justify these things? That we're able to justify our experience and knowledge and
yes,
science and
yes.
Yeah. And do you think like
obviously we were right. I was outlining the
Yeah. And do you think like, hey, we've gotten as far as we can get is like this is just the way it is? This in terms of atheism, like this is just the way it is. We can't know.
Okay, well, this maybe I should have brought this up earlier, right? Obviously, I think that a problem that this kind of discussion's having, which you have avoided more than most people, I think it's so important because you're mentioning it now, is a lot of people do something like where they go, oh, but how well does Christianity compare against atheism? Which to me seems kind of like a confused or misleading approach, because atheism is better matched to something like bare theism, right? Where bare theism is just commitment to some god or gods. Obviously, they get a bit of leeway based on how they want to define God, but typically it's just a theist commits to some agential creator of the universe, reality, whatever, and an atheist rejects it. So I think it's a bit unreasonable to go, oh, but how does atheism account for this, or what's entailed by atheism? Because it's just an attitude towards a singular proposition. I think more reasonably you'd be comparing your Christianity to my specific model of naturalism, in which case I need you to repeat the question.
Well, I would actually not agree with you on what you just said. I think the real categories are Christian and non-Christian, right? And so you have Romans 1 tells us that all men know God exists, and you're suppressing that knowledge, right? And exchanging it for something else. And that's the default state of man. The default state of man is that we all know God exists and we're all suppressing that knowledge. And God, in his mercy chooses to save some people. And so those people are no longer suppressing that knowledge, right? So now I forget where I was going with this. Oh, so you have Christian and non-Christian, and non-Christian is variations of the exact same thing, which is rebellion against God, right? The non-Christian. And it could be
That's fine.
0 gods, 1 God, 10 gods, a million gods. It doesn't matter. So that's why I think really it's Christian versus non-Christian, just in totality. Because only Christianity can provide these foundations that we both agree are important. Well, at least I think we agreed that they're important. And I think that's how you can determine what's true, right? Because we're living by faith. We all are. I don't care if you're a Christian or not, you're living by faith. And so we're looking towards that unseen thing. So discerning what's true is going to be a little bit different than a science experiment, right? And so we can logically show that if you say all other worldviews except one leave you in an absurd mess, that that's the impossibility of the contrary. It has to be that way, or else me and you are just wasting our time.
Yeah, no, I can grant that, right? 'Cause I think the first point is that, yeah, I think non-Christian is better because that implies like contrastive worldviews, whereas where atheism is just attitude on a single proposition. So non-Christian I prefer more as like the terminology that should be used. But as for the, I also agree that yes, if it's the case that there can be 2 options, then there's no longer it's well, theoretically you can still kind of like know things, but it would be in a less of an objective manner, because you'd almost have like a schism of epistemology where it's, people on one side that go, oh, the reason behind it's this person, the other one's like, oh, the reason behind it's this, which is effectively what's still going on now. So I can grant that as well. But the kind of like line of reasoning I'm drawing from that then is saying, well, look, the justification for the claim that there is some, contradiction in denying this would be by doing an analysis of a contrastive, competing model, which is what we're doing. But then when we got to the end of that model comparison, where we got to the necessary entity features, and I said, well, look, they see on both sides it seems to be brute facts, because this, after all, this is just a metaphysical account for epistemology. Then you said, oh, but it's a contradiction otherwise. Well, that is kind of where we need to kind of solve the problem, right? Because I wouldn't agree that there just happens to be a contradiction in denying them, because as long as mine just like compensates for whatever's removed by denying your model, then it's fine. And to clarify, but I mean, like, let's say I deny your God, and then in doing that, I lose an account for uniformity of nature. If I then produce an account of one that isn't your God, then problem solved.
Yes. If you want to end this argument, you just have to produce a worldview that accounts for the human experience to the same level.
That's what I was doing, though. Then you said it was subject to the impossibility of the contrary.
Well, I don't know that, because you went into quantum fields, and that's where I was trying to push you a little bit, because now you're coming into the, I'm going to say the creation, but I think you know what I mean. Like, now we're coming into the contingent things, unless, I don't know of anybody that says these things are sort of self-existent and eternal. Real quick, while you're grabbing your thought, hey guys, if you're watching this and you're enjoying this, just like, subscribe, smash that like button. That's how it gets us in the algorithm and gets more people in here and gets the conversation going, so that, eventually we have a lot of people here, and we can answer a lot of different questions. So if you're enjoying this, smash the like button, subscribe. We're going to do this every Thursday at 6:00. Okay, go ahead. What were you saying?
Yeah, so what I was getting at is, even regardless of whether or not other people commonly do it, it's actually surprisingly more common. You think there's a guy on TikTok somewhere called a Tupac. He's not a black rapper, to clarify. He's like some random white guy.
I was like, he's back.
But yeah, I know. No resurrection, unfortunately. But no, he's run unnecessary. His is arguably, I think he knows more quantum science because it's less fleshed out philosophically. But he also commits to it, just not for tag purposes. So yeah, it might be a little bit niche, but I think that's because many people who know more about it are physicists, and many physicists don't really concern themselves with metaphysics, right? Which is,
Yeah.
unfortunate. I think they'd be good if a lot of them did, but
Hmm.
that's kind of, for me, it seems kind of besides the point, because to me, God isn't anything that's like derived from current knowledge and science. It's definitely from human experience, but to me, it's almost equivalent to like importing some sui generis entity as like a pretty reasonable account for this frame, like list of data, this collection of data. So all I'm doing is just taking what could be contingent and saying, okay, but for the sake of my metaphysical thesis, I'm going to stipulate that it's necessary, and then see how well it compares to the theistic stipulation. Hence why I ended up saying, well, look, if the theistic model is just trying to be an account for it, and they
Yeah.
are just baking in assumptions for the theory,
Hmm.
maybe as parsimoniously and coherently as possible, of course.
Yeah.
That includes things like, okay, we're saying God has a mind, and he has aseity, which kind of like it arguably circularly explains the necessity, omnipotence, omniscience,
Hmm.
omnipresence, omnibenevolence, all that stuff. Okay, well, considering they're also getting all these free commitments to explain the data, I can also do the same thing as long as the objective is being fulfilled. That being, does it account for epistemology?
Are you saying I'm getting free commitments?
Well, I'm getting free
Oh,
commitments in
okay.
virtue
Okay.
of you having what is it? Oh, okay. Things presumably what you're saying is they're not brute facts because they're like necessary
Hmm.
commitments to have an account for epistemology. You're saying something like, oh well, it needs to have a mind because that is like a requirement to explain the epistemological axioms, which is the contention I'm having. So I'm saying, well, it's evidently not if I can explain it without it effectively.
Right. So you were trying to do the worldview analysis and keep going. Okay. I follow you. Yeah. I don't know, man. I would, because you started to just root it in the physical. And I think that's the thing that needs to be avoided. I personally, um, I'm not sure how that moves us past just appealing to any other
Well,
physical thing.
the word physical is kind of besides the point, right? Because physical, as I was saying earlier, it. I find when it comes to ontology is very ill-defined. Like people often say God is immaterial. I don't really dock them points to saying God's immaterial because immaterial is kind of ill-defined. It just means
Yeah.
not spatially extended. But you can question what that even means for it to be spatially extended. Like what is space, for example?
Yeah.
So the physical thing is irrelevant, right? All physical means, for the sake of the discussion, is what's understood under science, which is kind of
Yeah.
how I'm using to refer to. I'm saying, okay, well, this is a type of thing that's distinct from ghosts and
Yeah.
um well platonic objects, stuff like that, right? So
Hmm.
just stuff understood under science. But and that could theoretically include mathematical objects, because you were mentioning like mathematical stuff earlier. I
Hmm.
could commit to everything being like some sort of mathematical realism, because to me it's irrelevant as to whether it's maths or some vague physical objects, right?
Yeah.
To me it's completely irrelevant, because ontology is just vague in general. It's just about you can even dismiss the physics and the material and just treat this and God as of the same kind of like way you would imagine like an apple and a pear are the same uh, physical thing. It's just that they differentiate in features like aseity, being mind, whatever. Because
Yeah.
it's not that you have this lineage of physical objects and you have quantum fields. Because as I said earlier, it's almost like using physics to mirror like eternal creation as well, right? Because it's saying that all of these all of these higher order structures that have this appearance of supervening over the quantum fields, electrons, but a car, right? A car is constituent of these, compounds, constituent of these
Hmm.
elements, constituent of these subatomic particles, yada yada yada. You get quantum fields, right? Similarly to how you can say the car is just part of this kind of like causal history or causal plan from God. It's just
Hmm.
that maybe the relations are a little bit different on either side. And then ultimately, to me, what it boils down to is the commitments of whether or not it has a mind, effectively, right? That's
Yeah.
the main thing. Is the main contention is, does the model need to have a mind? Because having a mind is kind of the crucial, kind of like fundamental part of what it means there to be a
Hmm.
creator that chose to
Hmm.
create the universe. And then, you know, stuff like Christianity. Christianity wouldn't make sense if God didn't have a mind.
And
So
a lot of
the
things that
question is,
need,
can I explain it?
yes, because a lot of things that need to be accounted for through mind, right? Would you agree to that? Like if we have all these,
Such as what?
like laws of logic, mathematics, things that exist only in the mind, you know, immaterial conceptual laws of thought. I mean, their origin, you know, must be mind, unless you know where another place thoughts come from.
Yeah, I think what I'll grant, right, is I probably yapped a bit earlier, and you weren't able to properly acknowledge every single like small, because I have a habit of like, you know, it's coherent, but I tend to like throw a lot of things in there at once,
Yeah.
right? So earlier on, I mentioned how laws of logic and things like uniformity of nature can be reduced down to regularities, and then the regularities are grounded in a quantum field. So I'll give you an example, right, which I forgot to do earlier. So law of logic, right? A equals A, for example, is just to say that for any object, the object is itself, right? And I can just say that that's just in virtue of how quantum field configurations work, right? When it produces something, it's just in virtue of its nature that this thing isn't simultaneously something else. Because, you know, one, that's just incoherent under any model, because that makes no sense to us. And two, that's just about as much of an explanation as you'll get under theism as well, right? It reflects God's logical nature, right? It reflects the quantum field's logical nature. It's all reducible to the nature or essence of this quantum field Q or quantum fields, you know, with an S. And then same with something like uniformity of nature.
Right. So this is actually good. And I want to just, if you don't mind, if you don't think this is terribly rude, I'll probably make this the last point and then I'll give you the last word. But I got a hard 7:30 stop time and I got one more person that would like to get on. Is that all right? Are you there?
Actually, honestly, for me, it's like 1 in the morning, and this has been a very, very good discussion. I'm actually liking this more than any other pre-sub discussion I've ever had in my entire life, right?
Thank
so
you.
Yes,
that was
I'm fine
actually
with
my
that.
goal.
Let's just get it out of the way, and I can always come back in the future.
Yeah, that you know, that was my goal, because you know how abrasive precept can get, and I wanted to like actually talk about things. And all I was going to say, the last thing I was going to say is,
yes,
we start to, you know, you appealed to the quantum fields, and maybe think about this and come back and talk again, because you're my first guest, so that puts you at the top of the list every day. But you started to push more and more and more towards something that resembles the Christian God. And that's what I would say, is you do a worldview analysis and you're really trying to find a worldview that can account for, you know, the human experience. The more you start to dial it in, the more and more and more it's going to look like Christianity, until ultimately it's just Christianity by a different name. Now, that right there was an assertion of what would happen. I've just seen it happen many times. And the more we dial it in, the more it becomes Christianity. And finally you're like, oh yeah, I'm just like redefining Christianity. That's what I was going to say. If you want to have the last word, go ahead.
You could definitely use that as a springboard, right? Like I think that would be a good way in which to say, okay, let's focus on the asymmetries between the two, which is kind of what I was doing. Let's focus on the asymmetries between the two metaphysical theses and see, you know, how close can I get this not non-Christian to the Christian model, which for me is fine, right? Because I've always noticed that. It's like, you know what, even if, you know, I end up, you know, dissing a lot of Christians for their philosophy, you know, I do find that. And, you know, even though Tag, for example, gets a lot of hate, and, you know, reasonably so, because it's so awfully run half the time, it has massively motivated me to have a good fleshed out like metaphysics.
Right.
You know,
Otherwise you
occasionally
get real
some of the
jammed up.
metaphysics is kind of tailored towards Christians, where like I'll like grant them a lot of stuff. It does like, you know, it has been helpful, right? I think like my worldview was originally motivated watching Darth Dawkins videos and thinking, how can I ruin this guy on a live if I have like, the most like comprehensive worldview ever? And look, here I am, right, in another one. So,
hey, you
yeah,
know what's
I'll
funny?
definitely show up in the future. Well, not definitely, right? I'm relatively busy, but I'll probably show up in the future at some point.
Okay, and I'll leave with this. Darth Dawkins also motivated me, because I was like, he's such a bonehead. There has to be a way to talk about this that doesn't just make everyone want to punch you in the face.
For real.
So
oh my god, that's ridiculous. No, I appreciate that. I was really concerned you were gonna say, oh, he's my best buddy. I go drinking with him every
no, like, oh, gosh, he's so abrasive. Oh my gosh. So, but hey, man, thank you for being on here. I really appreciate it, and I hope I definitely see you again.
Also, you should. There was a guy in the guest list who literally just disappeared. I was about to say this, right? Called Orthodox, who is also running tag in my DMs in this very moment because we had a debate from beforehand. He's joining me because he sees me in a live in the
Oh,
same
well, we'll
discussion.
get him
But
in
if you
there.
catch him again, give him a follow because he's actually pretty good.
Oh, okay. I'll see if he's maybe in the chat here. Yeah. Orthodox. Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Hold on. I
you
see
might
him.
message. Yeah, he was called Orphan. He has like a black. Yeah, he's pretty chill actually. He knows his stuff. He interrogates views properly. So
Okay.
maybe you could probably drag him up in the future if he wants to dish it out on the panel. But yeah, anyway, good conversation.
Awesome.
Good,
Thank you.
perfect timing as well.
Yes,
Perfect
sir,
timing.
brother. Thank you. I appreciate you being here. All right, guys, that was fun. That was good. I hope it was not too boring. He kind of brought the heat. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't expecting that. I'll say that. I wasn't expecting that for my first guest. So that was great. So we have a spot now. There's nobody on deck. So if somebody wants to come on and talk, the topic is faith is greater than science, right? Why science relies on faith. Actually, faith is the basis for everything. It's the basis for how you operate every day in the world. It's the basis for science. Without faith, nothing gets off the ground. We were talking and we were defining faith through Hebrews 11:1. It's the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things unseen. So the assurance being the foundation of what you expect. When the word hoped for there in the verse doesn't mean like I hope I get a bike for Christmas. It means like what I expect. So the foundation for what you expect, and then the conviction of things unseen. And that word conviction has to do with persuasive evidence. It's actually legal language. So it's the persuasive evidence of things you haven't seen yet. And so we were saying that, or at least I was saying, but I think me and him agreed, is that, we all operate by faith if that's the definition of faith, because the future is always unseen and we're always stepping into it, not really knowing if it's going to be logical, if tomorrow's going to be like today, right? So that was our definition of faith that we were saying is the foundation of science. Without that, you're not going to do science. And I'm going to go one step deeper because, and we didn't kind of get to this, but Hebrews 11:6, I'm going to pull it up so that I don't misquote it. Hebrews 11:6 goes on and says, and without faith, it is impossible to please him, meaning God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. That is literally how everybody lives their life every single day. Today's topic was about science. But what if I take that verse and I apply it to science, right? We said our foundation for science is, we just picked logic and induction, right? We picked two things, logic and induction. There's a million, but we picked two. So if we were talking about faith, or talking about science, we would say, and without faith, it's impossible to please science. And when we say please science, we mean, be successful as a scientist, use the scientific method, do an experiment, right? We're not like, we're not saying science is something you can please, but it's impossible to please science, to actually engage in science without faith. And whoever would seek to use the scientific method must believe that the scientific method works, that laws of logic exist, that the tomorrow will be like today, and that belief, and that science will reward those who seek it, right? So it's very easy to take science and put it into Hebrews 11:6 and see the parallel. So that's when you have knuckleheads like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who wants to hate on religion and say there's no evidence, for God, and that's why it's called faith and not evidences. That's why religions are called faiths and they're not called evidences. Science doesn't escape it. Science is in the same boat. Science is a faith-based initiative. You're believing in something you haven't seen yet, and unless you engage in it, unless you believe the scientific method will work, you'll never get the reward of science. Unless you believe that the world is exactly the way it was when you went to sleep, you'll never get the reward of going into the world and engaging. Unless you believe first that your boss is going to pay you You won't go to work, do the work, and then receive the unseen reward of your paycheck. That's literally how we live life. And this whole thought process started because I was like, it seems kind of whack that God would set us up as Christians to where everybody gets to live by sight, gets to live by seeing is believing, and he requires us as Christians to live by believing is seeing. We got to believe first. But as I dug into it, I realized everybody lives by believing is seeing. It's the way of the world. So the question is, not do I have to have faith, not do I have to believe before I see. That's already the way the world is. That's the way it is. The question goes back to that original verse, Hebrews 11:1. And what is your assurance? What is your foundation? Is your foundation a circular argument, circular reasoning? The future will be like the past because the future always has been like the past, which is really to say nothing. Or in the Christian worldview, is your assurance God, right? The creator who upholds things with the word of his power, who's promised that the seasons and cycles will continue, who's faithful, who's just, who's loving, who's good, right? Which foundation actually gives you a foundation for science, right? The emptiness of atheism or the triune God of the Bible who created you so that you could know him and gave you a wonderful world that you could discover and the tools to discover it, right? And that's what we're talking about. That's why we say faith is greater than science. And legit. Oh, so I got my producer here, by the way, Danny, just pulled this up. That's great. We're going to use that again next time. That's awesome. Yep. That translation said it's the confidence. Actually, this is great. This is how I'll end. That word assurance is awesome because it's a foundation. I'm sorry. The word has a sort of a wide semantic domain, but it has to do with foundations. It has to do with like reality. It has to do with confidence. It's the same word that's used to speak of Christ earlier when they say Christ is the substance of the Father, I think is how it says it, right? So it's that same word, it's reality, but it's also that word assurance in the Greek hypostasis. It also is legal language, and it had to do in like just the world at the time, the Greek word that would be used with deeds and titles to land, right? So you can relate to that here in the 21st century. If you have a title to a piece of land, it doesn't matter if you've seen it or not, it's yours, right? It's a guarantee, a legal guarantee. That's what that word hypostasis has to do with. And so we have that promise, that guarantee that we're going to get what we expect from God. And how much greater is that than a title to a piece of land, the laws of the land, right? The government's laws that could fail at any time. We have the promise of God. So we have the assurance. Contrast that with atheism, which I'm sorry, just gives you a big shrug and goes, oh, well, it works. And that's just not a foundation, right? And that's not a dig at atheists. Atheists have just been duped into believing atheism, which is just a worldview that is empty. It gives you nothing. And so we're here trying to show you the difference, right? You saw us do a little bit of a worldview analysis that kind of got a little heady, but that's fine. They won't all be like that. But we're going to show you the difference between Christianity and the rest of the world, the Christian and the non-Christian worldviews, and hopefully give you the confidence. There's two things we're doing here. One, we want to give Christians the confidence to face the relentless press of secularism, right? So that's what we'll be doing. We'll be trying to show you that Christianity is not one option among many. It's not a buffet of options that you just get to pick whatever you want and they're all equally good. The Christianity is the only true religion that you can demonstrate it, right? And that all the other worldviews ultimately fail. So that's it. We want to encourage believers, and then we want to show. me, myself, and I have a soft spot for atheists because atheism is so empty. I just feel bad for the people who've been sucked into it. But we want to show non-Christian worldviews that that they already live like Christians, right? They really already are Christians. I would, and so anyways, if you like that, if you like what we did, if you want to see more, please like and subscribe. That's what gets us pushed out to more people and will allow the audience to grow. And so you'll see this content every Thursday, 6 o'clock, same time. I appreciate everybody that joined in. Oh, hold on. I'm going to talk to this guy real quick. I'm not here right now to I wonder if he means don't invite me to multi-guest. That's all right. I'm supposed to stop at 7:30, so I'll give him a couple of minutes. Anyways, that was just me talking at the end here. Yeah, like, subscribe so that the audience can grow, so we can get more people, so we can have more conversations, more worldviews. I'm not mean. I'm not going to get hard with people. It's going to be nice and cordial. Cool. But I'm going to say atheism is not good. So, all right, guys, we'll call it an evening now. There's nobody up. And thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next Thursday.